House Speaker Mike Johnson's holding a news conference on all of this. Let's listen in.
Now finally appear ready to do what Republicans and President Trump and millions of hardworking American people have been asking them to do for weeks. But as we said from the beginning, the people's government cannot be held hostage to further anyone's political agenda. That was never right. And shutting down the government never produces anything. It never has, if you study history. And so here we are. I want to remind everybody this morning of another critical point that you've heard me here repeat over and over the last several weeks.
Okay, so we need to talk about what just happened to Speaker Mike Johnson, because we just witnessed the complete and total public meltdown of a House Speaker in a way that we haven't seen in modern American politics. Johnson, who's been branded MAGA Mike for his loyalty to Trump and his hardline conservative positions, had an absolute emotional breakdown captured live on camera during what was supposed to be a routine press conference about the ongoing government shutdown. And I'm not talking about just a bad day or some tough questioning. I'm talking about Johnson visibly losing control, raising his voice in frustration and anger, unable to answer basic questions being shouted at him, completely surrendering control of his own press conference as chaos erupted around him, and ultimately admitting on camera that he's overwhelmed by the crisis engulfing his speakership. Witnesses describe the scene as Johnson's authority being completely exposed as hollow. He couldn't command his own press event, couldn't restore order when things got out of hand, couldn't project the strength and leadership that a speaker needs in moments of crisis. And this public meltdown is just the visible manifestation of deeper institutional collapse. Johnson has lost control of his Republican conference. MAGA hardliners are openly rebelling against him for not being extreme enough. GOP moderates are turning on him for being too extreme and destroying the party's electoral prospects. Democrats are relentlessly attacking him and exploiting every weakness. And the government shutdown that's now dragging on for record lengths is creating real human suffering that voters are blaming directly on Republican dysfunction, which means on Johnson's failed leadership. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video. So let's set the scene here, because understanding the pressures that led to this meltdown helps explain why Johnson finally cracked in such spectacular public fashion. The government shutdown is now in its second month with no resolution in sight, and with devastating consequences mounting daily for federal workers, for government services, for the broader economy. Johnson's strategy, if you can even call it a strategy, has been to keep the House out of session to avoid the public spectacle of bills failing on the floor. But that non-strategy means nothing gets done. The shutdown continues indefinitely, and pressure builds on Johnson from every direction simultaneously. MAGA hardliners, led by figures like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who we've discussed recently, resigned in disgust with Trump in the direction of the party, have been demanding that Johnson use the shutdown as leverage to extract massive concessions from Democrats on conservative policy priorities. They want steep spending cuts. They want conservative policy riders attached to any funding bills. They want confrontation rather than compromise. But those demands are completely unrealistic because Democrats control the Senate and obviously won't agree to a MAGA wish list just to reopen the government. On the other side, GOP moderates representing competitive districts are panicking because the shutdown is destroying Republicans' political standing in their districts. Their constituents want government to function, want federal workers to get paid, don't care about the ideological fights that MAGA hardliners are prioritizing. These moderates are demanding that Johnson pass clean funding bills that can actually get through the Senate and reopen the government before the political damage becomes irreparable. These two factions within Johnson's conference have completely incompatible demands. He literally cannot satisfy both simultaneously. Any action he takes alienates one faction or the other, so he's been paralyzed, unable to move in either direction, just letting the crisis fester, while trying to avoid forcing his members to take difficult votes that would expose the party's divisions publicly. But that paralysis itself is a form of leadership failure that both factions are attacking him for. MAGA hardliners say he's weak for not fighting harder. Moderates say he's reckless for not ending the shutdown. And Johnson is caught between these impossible pressures with no good options and no clear path forward. The press conference that devolved into chaos apparently started as Johnson's attempt to project confidence and unity, to present some kind of coherent Republican message about the shutdown and about their demands for reopening government. But it fell apart almost immediately when a Democratic member crashed the press conference and started shouting questions that Johnson couldn't or wouldn't answer. Other reporters piled on with follow-up questions about the suffering caused by the shutdown, about Republican divisions, about Johnson's failed leadership. And instead of maintaining composure and handling the hostile questions with the kind of political skill that effective leaders demonstrate under pressure, Johnson visibly lost it. His voice rose in anger and frustration. He tried to shut down questions he didn't like. He gave rambling non-answers to direct questions. He looked completely overwhelmed by a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond his control. And ultimately, he just gave up, ending the press conference prematurely and retreating from the cameras in what witnesses described as barely controlled panic. The image of Johnson storming out of the House floor on a separate occasion shows similar loss of control. A speaker is supposed to be the master of House procedures, controlling debate and votes with authority derived from their position and from respect of members. But Johnson apparently couldn't maintain order on the floor, couldn't calm members who are in revolt, couldn't exercise the basic procedural control that the speakership requires. When a speaker has to storm out of their own chamber because they can't control it, that's complete leadership failure, visible to everyone. So why does Johnson's public meltdown matter, beyond just a spectacle in the political drama? Because it reveals that the Republican Party has become ungovernable under Trump's influence and under MAGA ideology. The party is so fractured between incompatible factions that no leader can hold it together. Johnson isn't uniquely incompetent. Kevin McCarthy failed before him for the same reasons, and anyone who replaces Johnson will face the same impossible dynamics. The problem isn't just individual leadership. The problem is that the Republican Party as currently constituted cannot govern because its factions have fundamentally incompatible goals and visions. And when a party can't govern, when it can't even maintain basic order or pass basic legislation like funding bills, voters rationally conclude that party shouldn't have power. That's why Johnson's meltdown matters. It's the visible proof that Republicans cannot be trusted with governing authority. All right, so let's dig into the specific dynamics that led to Johnson's meltdown, the deeper institutional problems it reveals, and what it means for the immediate future of Republican governance, because the details show this isn't just about one speaker's bad week, but about systemic dysfunction that's destroying the party's ability to function. The press conference chaos where Johnson lost control apparently unfolded when Democratic Representative Rosa DeLauro walked up to the microphones where Johnson was speaking and started loudly demanding answers about why Republicans were keeping government shut down while federal workers miss paychecks. This kind of direct confrontation at a leadership press conference is highly unusual and breaks normal congressional decorum. But DeLauro apparently calculated that Republicans' shutdown was so indefensible that dramatic confrontation was justified and would make good television showing Johnson's inability to defend his position. And she was right. When Johnson tried to respond to her interruptions, he couldn't provide satisfactory answers. When he tried to have her removed or ignored, it made him look weak and unable to control even his own press events.
I made it clear for months that I thought there were serious flaws in the underlying bill, and I had hoped that the Senate would work to fix and correct those. They decided to go a different direction. That's their prerogative. I was surprised and disappointed by that, but overall, I mean, the bill has passed, Congress has spoken, and we did what was necessary. I hope it brings comfort to the victims and the survivors.
The whole scene devolved into shouting and chaos, with Johnson looking increasingly flustered and angry. The questions that reporters shouted at Johnson that he couldn't answer apparently included direct inquiries about specific families suffering from the shutdown, about what Johnson's actual plan was for ending the crisis, about whether he lost control of his conference, about why he was keeping the House out of session instead of trying to pass legislation. These are all legitimate questions that a competent speaker should be able to address with some combination of empathy, strategic vision, and political messaging. But Johnson apparently had no good answers. He couldn't articulate a clear strategy because he doesn't have one, beyond hoping something changes without him having to make hard decisions. He couldn't show empathy for suffering families without acknowledging that Republican intransigence is causing that suffering. He couldn't claim to control his conference when everyone knows he doesn't. So instead of answering, he got defensive and angry, which only made him look weaker. The admission that he's overwhelmed by the crisis is particularly damaging because leaders are never supposed to publicly admit they can't handle the job. Even when things are genuinely overwhelming, political leaders are supposed to project confidence and competence. Johnson's public acknowledgement that he's overwhelmed is essentially an admission of failure, an acknowledgement that the job is beyond his capabilities. Once a leader admits that, it's almost impossible to recover credibility because followers need to believe their leader can handle whatever challenges arise. The MAGA hardliner rebellion against Johnson has been building for weeks, but has intensified dramatically as the shutdown drags on without any wins to show for it. These hardliners see the shutdown as leverage, a weapon that forces Democrats to negotiate and accept conservative policy demands. But that leverage only works if you're actually willing to keep the government shut down indefinitely until Democrats cave. Johnson apparently isn't willing to do that because he understands the political damage it's causing. but his unwillingness to fight to the bitter end makes hardliners view him as weak and ineffective. They're openly questioning why they should follow a speaker who won't use the power they have. Some are reportedly discussing whether to move to vacate the chair and force Johnson out, just like they forced McCarthy out. The moderate Republican revolt against Johnson comes from the opposite direction, but is equally destructive to his authority. Moderates from competitive districts are watching polls showing them getting destroyed by association with the shutdown. Their constituents are angry at Republicans for the dysfunction. These moderates need to distance themselves from the shutdown and from MAGA extremism to have any chance at re-election. But as long as Johnson keeps the House shut down and keeps pursuing MAGA-friendly strategies, these moderates are tied to positions that are electoral poison in their districts. So they're turning on Johnson too, demanding he end the shutdown and pass bipartisan legislation. Some are threatening to vote with Democrats on discharge petitions to force votes on funding bills, regardless of Johnson's wishes. The Democratic attacks on Johnson are relentless and increasingly effective because Democrats have the political high ground. They're the ones trying to reopen government and get federal workers paid. Republicans are the ones keeping government closed over ideological demands. That's a winning political position for Democrats, so they're hammering Johnson daily, holding press events highlighting families hurt by the shutdown, forcing votes that make Republicans look bad, and generally making Johnson's life miserable. The Rosa DeLauro confrontation at his press conference is just the most visible example of a broader Democratic strategy of aggressive confrontation that's designed to make Johnson crack under pressure. The complete exposure of Johnson's hollow authority means that even if he survives as Speaker, he's lost the ability to lead effectively. Authority in Congress comes from a combination of formal powers and informal respect and credibility. Johnson still has the formal powers of the speakership, but he's lost the informal authority. Members don't respect his strategic judgment, they don't trust his promises, they don't fear his threats, and they don't believe he can deliver wins. Without that informal authority, the formal powers are largely useless. Johnson can't build coalitions because members don't believe joining his coalitions leads anywhere productive. The procedural coups and lawsuits that are upending Johnson's agenda apparently include various legal and procedural challenges to Republican actions. Democrats and outside groups are filing lawsuits challenging Republican procedural maneuvers. Members are using parliamentary procedures to force votes Johnson doesn't want. All of these challenges are exploiting weaknesses in Johnson's control and making it harder for him to manage the House on the rare occasions when it's actually in session. The description of the Capitol as a dumpster fire on national television captures the public perception problem Republicans face. When the American people watch their Congress, they see chaos, dysfunction, and partisan warfare instead of serious people working on serious problems. That image is devastating for the party in power in the House because voters hold them responsible for making things work. The visual of Johnson losing control reinforces the narrative that Republicans can't govern. The lack of strategy that both factions criticize Johnson for is perhaps the most fundamental problem. The speaker needs to have a theory of the case, a strategic vision for how to navigate difficult situations toward desired outcomes. Johnson doesn't appear to have that. He's reacting day to day, trying to avoid immediate crises without any larger strategic framework for how his actions today lead to better positioning tomorrow. That absence of strategy means he's just surviving crisis to crisis without making progress toward any goals. The fracture point for MAGA leadership, the analysts describe, reflects growing recognition that MAGA as a governing philosophy might be inherently ungovernable. MAGA is great at opposition, at attacking enemies, at generating outrage, at mobilizing base voters against targets, but it's terrible at the compromises and coalition building that actual governance requires. Johnson's failure is MAGA's failure, the demonstration that MAGA can't translate political power into policy outcomes because the ideology is too rigid and the coalition is too fractured. The total collapse of party unity is visible in the fact that Republicans can't agree on basic governance questions. They can't agree on whether to keep government shut down or reopen it. They can't agree on what demands to make of Democrats. They can't agree on whether Johnson should stay or go. When a party can't agree on anything, it can't function as a party. It becomes just a collection of individuals pursuing their own interests with no shared purpose or direction. The loss of grip on power is evident in Republicans' inability to pass legislation, even on matters where they theoretically agree. They control the House, but they can't pass bills because their own members won't vote for them. That's not power. That's the appearance of power without the substance. Real power is the ability to enact your agenda. Republicans have lost that ability, even in the one chamber they control. The looming votes and major investigations that Johnson faces in coming weeks include potential votes on funding bills, if he can be forced to bring them to the floor, votes on raising the debt ceiling, which will create another crisis, and oversight hearings on various Trump administration scandals. Each of these is an opportunity for Johnson's authority to be challenged and for his coalition to fracture further. Without any wins under his belt and with his authority already collapsed, Johnson has no reservoir of goodwill or credibility to draw on to navigate these challenges. The talk of new leadership that's reportedly happening in private Republican meetings reflects growing recognition that Johnson might not survive and that the party needs to be thinking about alternatives. But the same dynamics that make Johnson ineffective would affect any replacement. The problem isn't Johnson personally, it's the impossible coalition he's trying to lead. Any replacement would face the same warring factions, the same incompatible demands, the same strategic paralysis. Republicans might replace Johnson just to be seen doing something, but replacement won't solve the underlying dysfunction. The rebellion against Johnson from various quarters simultaneously is creating a situation where he has enemies on all sides and allies nowhere. MAGA hardliners attack him from the right, moderates attack him from the center, Democrats attack him from the left. Senate Republicans are frustrated with him for creating problems they have to deal with. Even some of his supposed allies are privately questioning his competence. When a leader is under attack from all directions simultaneously, it becomes almost impossible to maintain position because you can't defend against threats coming from everywhere at once. The end of MAGA's congressional discipline reflects breakdown of the fear-based loyalty that Trump established. For years, Republican members followed MAGA direction because they feared primary challenges from Trump-backed candidates. But that fear is weakening as Trump's legal problems mount, as his political position deteriorates, and as MAGA-backed candidates lose winnable elections. Without fear enforcing discipline, the MAGA coalition in Congress is falling apart because members are making independent calculations about their political interests rather than blindly following leadership. Okay, so let's break down what happens next for Johnson, for House Republicans, for the shutdown, and for the broader political landscape. Because Johnson's meltdown is both a symptom of and a catalyst for larger political realignment that's unfolding in real time. First and immediately, Johnson faces very serious questions about whether he can continue as Speaker after such public displays of lost control and failed leadership. Speakership isn't just about having the votes to win the position. It's about having the authority and respect to actually lead the caucus. Johnson might technically still have the votes to survive a motion to vacate, but if he's lost the respect and confidence of significant portions of his conference, he can't function effectively even if he stays in position. That creates pressure for him to resign to spare himself and the party further embarrassment. If he refuses to resign, pressure could build for Republicans to force him out through a motion to vacate, just like happened to McCarthy. The problem with removing Johnson is that Republicans still don't have an obvious alternative who could do better. The same impossible dynamics, warring factions with incompatible demands, would affect anyone who becomes Speaker. McCarthy couldn't navigate these dynamics. Johnson can't navigate them. Anyone who replaces Johnson will face the same challenges. So Republicans might be stuck with a failed Speaker simply because they can't agree on anyone better. That's a terrible position for a party to be in, but it's where Republican dysfunction has led them. The government shutdown trajectory is getting worse rather than better because Johnson's meltdown has made resolution even harder. When a speaker loses credibility and authority, it becomes more difficult to build coalitions or negotiate agreements. Democrats have even less incentive to negotiate with Johnson because they can see he can't deliver Republican votes for any deal. And Republicans have less reason to follow Johnson's lead because they don't believe he knows where he's going. So the shutdown likely continues much longer, the damage continues mounting, and the political costs to Republicans continue accumulating. The human toll of extended shutdown is creating real crises for federal workers and their families. People are missing multiple paychecks now, savings are depleted, families are facing evictions, can't pay medical bills, are going to food banks. Small businesses that serve federal workers are suffering. Government contractors are laying off employees. All of this human suffering is directly attributable to congressional dysfunction, specifically to Republican dysfunction, since they control the House and are preventing funding bills from passing. That suffering is generating intense political pressure on vulnerable Republicans who represent districts where federal workers live. The political consequences in 2026 are becoming more severe every day the shutdown continues. Voters are watching this dysfunction and are concluding Republicans can't govern. Democrats are building powerful campaign narratives around Republican chaos and suffering caused by Republican shutdown. Every day of continued shutdown gives Democrats more material for attack ads and makes Republican defenses weaker. The longer this goes, the worse Republicans' electoral prospects become, and Johnson's public meltdown gives Democrats perfect visual evidence of Republican leadership failure to use in campaign ads. The Democratic strategy going forward is to maintain unified opposition to Republican demands while highlighting human costs of shutdown and Republican responsibility for it. Democrats are in a politically strong position. They don't need to compromise because time is on their side, Every day of shutdown hurts Republicans politically more than it hurts Democrats, so Democrats can just wait for Republican position to become untenable and for enough Republicans to break ranks to pass clean funding bills. That's exactly what's likely to happen eventually. Political pressure will force enough moderate Republicans to vote with Democrats to reopen government against hardliner wishes. The moderate Republican breaking point is approaching as political pain becomes unbearable. At some point, members from competitive districts will decide their political survival requires voting to end the shutdown, regardless of what MAGA hardliners want and regardless of Johnson's wishes. Some are already reportedly discussing discharge petitions to force votes bypassing Johnson's control. If enough moderates join Democrats on discharge petitions, funding bills can pass despite hardliner opposition. That would be ultimate demonstration of Johnson's failed leadership, losing control even of what comes to the floor for votes. The MAGA hardliner response to moderates breaking ranks will be to threaten primary challenges and to attack moderates as traitors to conservative principles. But those threats are becoming less effective as Trump's political position weakens and as voters punish MAGA extremism in elections. Moderates increasingly believe they're better off defying MAGA and appealing to general election voters than blindly following MAGA and losing their seats. That calculation shift is what breaks MAGA's hold on the party. The broader Republican identity crisis that Johnson's meltdown exemplifies is about whether the party is MAGA or whether it's something else. MAGA has dominated the party for years through Trump's force of personality and through fear of his base. But MAGA is proving unable to govern. The party needs to decide whether to continue down the MAGA path despite mounting evidence it leads to electoral and governance failure, or whether to try to reclaim some version of pre-Trump conservatism. That's a fundamental existential question for the party that won't be resolved quickly or easily. The leadership vacuum Johnson's failure creates is about more than just the speakership. The Republican Party nationally lacks effective leadership at any level. Trump is under multiple indictments and facing potential convictions. Senate leadership is old and uninspiring. House leadership is collapsing in public failure. Governors who might provide alternative leadership are constrained by Trump's continued dominance of the base. This vacuum creates opportunity for new leaders to emerge, but also creates a period of chaos and directionlessness as various factions fight for control. The institutional damage to the House as an institution continues accumulating. Every day of dysfunction, every public spectacle of leadership failure, every shutdown continuing beyond reason, all of this damages public faith in Congress as an institution capable of addressing national problems. That institutional damage affects both parties and affects democracy itself. When people lose faith in democratic institutions, they become receptive to authoritarian alternatives, promising to cut through dysfunction and make things work. That's dangerous for long-term democratic health. The comparative advantage for Democrats from Republican dysfunction is both immediate and long-term. Immediately, Democrats are winning the political messaging battle around the shutdown and around governing competence. Long-term, Republican dysfunction makes Democrats the obvious choice for voters who want government to actually function. That advantage will persist as long as Republicans continue demonstrating they can't govern. The question of whether MAGA as movement survives this crisis depends partly on whether Trump survives his legal problems and partly on whether any other figure can lead MAGA effectively without Trump's unique qualities. MAGA has always been more about Trump personally than about ideology or policy. If Trump goes to prison or becomes too politically damaged to lead, MAGA might fragment or fade without his unifying presence. Johnson's failure suggests that MAGA lieutenants like him can't effectively lead the movement. They don't have Trump's ability to command loyalty and enforce discipline. The accountability moment for Republican Party is approaching, where voters will judge whether Republicans deserve continued power after demonstrating inability to govern. The 2026 midterms will be that accountability moment. If Republicans lose badly, it will be a clear verdict that voters reject their dysfunction and extremism. That rejection might finally force the party to reconsider its direction and leadership. But if Republicans manage to maintain or expand power despite all their failures, it suggests American democracy has deeper problems where dysfunction isn't punished electorally. Here's the bottom line. After examining all the angles, Speaker Mike Johnson had complete public meltdown captured on camera, where he lost control of his press conference, admitted he's overwhelmed, and exposed his hollow authority. His leadership has collapsed under impossible pressures from MAGA hardliners demanding confrontation and moderates demanding compromise. The government shutdown continues with devastating human and political consequences. Republicans are fracturing between incompatible factions that Johnson can't reconcile. His meltdown reveals systemic Republican dysfunction. The party has become ungovernable under MAGA ideology. Democrats are exploiting Republican chaos effectively, strengthening their position for 2026. Johnson faces potential removal, but Republicans lack better alternatives. The shutdown will likely end when enough moderates break ranks and vote with Democrats against hardliner wishes. MAGA's grip on congressional Republicans is weakening as fear of primary challenges loses effectiveness. The broader Republican identity crisis about whether to remain MAGA or move on remains unresolved. Johnson's failure exemplifies MAGA's inability to translate political power into governance. What happens next depends on whether Johnson survives, how long the shutdown continues before moderates rebel, and whether 2026 voters punish Republican dysfunction decisively. But Johnson's public meltdown marks a breaking point where MAGA's congressional strategy has visibly and dramatically failed for all to see.